I have adjusted the intro to be as slow as possible so that I can put a voiceover at the beginning. This is a raw, unedited video about trauma and me talking about trauma, and not necessarily the trauma that I went through, but what it is to be traumatized and what the definition of trauma is and who can and can't say what trauma is in your life. And it's raw, it's unedited. I've tried editing it and I can't. So just bear that in mind while you're watching it, that this is one take and done. Welcome back to my channel. This is another video that I'm doing today. So this would be 11/14/2023 part B, or part 2. But I didn't put part 1 on there, so I'm not going to add a part 2 now. But what I'm going to be doing is talking to you about something that I promised in one of my recent videos, and that was talking to you about trauma and the effect and effect of trauma. And there was a typo in the second one, and it bothers me, but I'm not going to go back and fix it. But I just want you to know that I do know that there's a title in there. There's no D in effects. But I'm going to talk to you from my point of view and what trauma is for me, but I'm also going to tell you about a couple things, a couple pitfalls that I fell into when it came to trauma. I had a job where we had to learn about trauma every year. And so I got a lot of information from trauma. But being one who has experienced lifelong trauma, the trauma training was actually very traumatizing. I'm not sure exactly how many times trauma was in that sentence, but it seems like it was there an awful lot. But one thing that I want to mention before I go into this is you don't have the right, other people don't have the right to determine whether or not what you experienced is trauma. Other people don't have the right to decide whether or not you were traumatized. That is not their place. So if someone tries to tell you that what happened to you wasn't traumatic, that's not their right. They don't have the right to do that. And they need to keep their opinions to themselves. If you're one of the people who sits there and says, well, that's not enough to be considered trauma, you're wrong. Trauma is in the eye of the traumatized, and you are not in their brain. You didn't experience it the way they did. And if they say it's trauma, it's trauma. So bear that in mind whenever you're speaking to someone who is talking about trauma. And the second thing is, you don't get to decide how they react to the trauma. You don't get to decide what they feel about the trauma. You don't get to decide what another person's behavior about trauma, whether that behavior is appropriate or not. Trauma is specific to the person who was traumatized. And the person who was traumatized is the only person who can decide whether or not their reaction to the trauma is appropriate. So don't put your own personal ideas on someone else's trauma, because that's just not fair. The second one actually came up with me and a family member when I was undergoing trauma, when I was experiencing real-time trauma about 10 years ago. And it was a very specific catalyst. It was a very specific set of, it was very specific circumstances under which I was experiencing the trauma. And I wasn't the only person who was being traumatized in this way, not by a long shot. And my family member said to me one day that she knew other people that were experiencing the same trauma, and they didn't behave the way I did, and that I shouldn't be behaving that way. And we've had discussions about this. We had discussion at the time about it, that it's not her place to determine whether or not I'm traumatized and whether or not my reaction is correct. Because my reaction to any trauma is right, because it's mine, it's my trauma, and it's my reaction to it. With the caveat of, you're not allowed to hurt someone else because you have been traumatized. You're not allowed to cause another person trauma just because you have been traumatized. That's not right. Don't induce trauma just because you had trauma. But we had discussions about it, and she said she knew other people that didn't react that way. And one of my responses to her was, well, you don't see your friend in the shower crying her eyes out because she hides that from you. So don't tell me that my reaction is wrong just because it's not the way you would react to something. And quite frankly, you've never been in this position, so don't tell me how you would react to it, because you may think you know, but you don't know. And we've come to an understanding since then, and she saw my point of view, which is a good thing. So those are the two things that I'm going to start off with. You don't get to determine whether or not what someone experienced was trauma. And you don't get to determine whether or not their emotional reaction to that trauma is correct, because those are both things that have to be determined by the person who was actually traumatized. So trauma. I'm going to talk specifically about me because trauma is specific for every person. And my trauma started quite literally when I was born. Until my parents got divorced, my father insulated me from what my mother was trying to do. Because I'm Gen X and because of when I was born, when they divorced, my mother got custody of me. And that did not stop my father from fighting for custody of me, but unlike Christopher Titus, my father didn't win. And I ended up living with the crazy person. And the thing that caused my trauma to begin, the instant I was born, was when the doctor said it's a girl. My mother never wanted a girl. She didn't want to have a girl. She didn't want to keep a girl. She didn't want to deal with a girl. So my trauma started because of my gender. And I had an older brother. I still have an older brother. And we were treated significantly differently because he's male and I'm female. That was the start of my trauma. I was forever the scapegoat. I was forever the whipping boy. I was forever the scapegoat. I was forever the one accused of whatever wrong had happened. I was the one forever treated as if I was the second-class citizen of the family. And honestly, she didn't hide the fact that she didn't like me because I was a girl. She told me very soon after my parents got divorced, and they got divorced when I was like 5 years old. She told me very soon after they got divorced that the reason she stopped having kids after me was because she was afraid she'd have another girl. I don't think there's any way to make it any more plain than that. So the beginning of my trauma was the person who was supposed to protect me no matter what. And she didn't protect me no matter what. She had no interest in having me around anyway, because I was a girl. The neurodivergence that I haven't mentioned, and still haven't mentioned, is one that was known from the get-go. It was obvious from the get-go. As soon as I became aware of other people, it was obvious that I had an issue. And over time, we figured out what that issue was, then found out what it was called, and it was never treated. It was never analyzed because that would have cost money, and my mother wasn't willing to do that. That is probably another reason why my autism was not diagnosed until so late in my life. Same thing with the ADHD. So it is what it is. I can't change those things. But that was the beginning of my trauma. Because I was a girl and a second-class citizen, my mother wasn't as concerned about my well-being as she could have been. And twice she put me into situations that I shouldn't have been in. Both times I was assaulted. One time it was a 16-year-old kid taking advantage of the fact that he had been put in charge of babysitting a 7-year-old girl. And the other time is the far more heinous one, because my mother's at the time boyfriend asked if he could take asked if I would be a subject for him. And my mother said yes. And walked me through the necessary actions. That's all I'm going to say about it, because it's still trauma. And that's all I'm going to say. You figured it out. I'm moving on. You have figured it out. I am moving on. If you haven't figured it out, you're not old enough to know, and I am moving on. When you get older, ask somebody. So there were those. In fact, I saw that person again when I was 19. And the very first thing out of his mouth was, "I have media of you." Anyway. The neurodivergence that I haven't mentioned makes me incredibly socially awkward. I always said I present as if I'm autistic because of this neurodivergent. Well, it turns out I actually was autistic too. But it made me incredibly socially awkward, and it kept me ostracized my entire life, and it kept me as an outcast, and it kept me on the margins, and it kept me in the bleachers, and it kept me away from society. And that in and of itself, being forcibly removed from society, was a trauma in and of itself. And when I got out of school, if you've watched one of my other videos, there were 3 years in college where that wasn't the case. And they were amazing years. When I got out of school, the ostracism and the marginalization and the bad-mouthing and the naysaying started up again. It was impossible for me to do anything right in the eyes of the other people with whom I worked. And it's very difficult to perform your job well when everybody is saying that you are not performing your job well. I need to stop touching the sides of this one. I did it again. So I did the same job for over 20 years, but I did it in a lot of different locations because of people bullying me and people traumatizing me. And it was always the coworkers that were supposed to be, coworkers. They would do things that would make me look bad intentionally. There would be deadlines that they wouldn't tell me about, and then when the deadlines would come, I wouldn't be prepared for them, and it made me look bad. Or they'd tell me when I'd have an hour to prepare. Now, being who I am, I generally got it done, but it wasn't done nearly to the standard that I could have. So that was painful in and of itself. So this has been lifelong trauma for me. The effects of it, especially the initial traumas with my mother and people that she put into my path. This is one of the effects. Up until the time that I went inside my house and didn't come out, I am and always have been hypervigilant. A group of people that I used to hang out with, and we were adults. Okay, I'm going to tell you right now, we played a stupid game, and it was a stupid game. We were adults, and we played this game. It was a stupid game. But the game was called Scream or Flinch. And the whole idea is you'd sneak up on somebody, and I'm not saying anybody should try this. This is not a suggestion of a game for you to try. Don't try this at home. Don't try this in the real world. But we would play a game called Scream or Flinch. And the idea was you'd sneak up on somebody, you'd go boo right in their ear, and you'd find out if they screamed or if they flinched. But because I was hypervigilant, nobody ever got the chance to sneak up on me. So, try as they might, they never knew whether I was Scream or Flinch. because they couldn't sneak up on me because of the hypervigilance. And hypervigilance means that you are aware of everything that is going on in your surroundings at any point in time, always. Because you never know where the next attack is going to come from. And that is the effect of trauma. You never know what's going to happen. One of the movies that they like to show in the trauma training, and it got to the point where I couldn't even watch the movie anymore. But it was the idea that you have these reflexes and you have these awarenesses that will keep you safe in the case of something dangerous coming, like a truck. So if there's a truck coming at you, then your senses will allow you to jump out of the way. And when the truck is gone, the danger is gone. But for those who have experienced lifelong trauma, there's always a truck. There is always a truck. So the video was this kid constantly jumping out of the way of trucks that were always coming. And it got to the point where I couldn't even watch that video anymore because it was so accurate as to how it felt to be traumatized. So hypervigilance is part of that. You're always aware of what's going on around you because you never know where the attack's going to come from. And my hypervigilance went into self-defense. And any point in time, if I walked into a room, I could name 5 things that I could use as a weapon if I needed to. And that's not a fun or happy or pleasant way to live when you are constantly on edge waiting for the next attack to come. And it led to other problems like PTSD, which is something that I now truly suffer from. And the PTSD is not really, I mean, the PTSD wasn't exactly post-trauma. It was, during trauma, DTSD, during trauma stress disorder, and PTSD, post-trauma stress disorder, because my life has been very traumatic from start to finish. There are some heinous things in my past. There are some heinous things that have happened, and those things have led to significant trauma. And the last normal day of my life, the last day that I would say was even coming close to something around normal, was the day before Halloween 2 or 3 years ago. I'd have to go back and check. But it was the day before Halloween 2 or 3 years ago. And I got a call from someone who knew my mother. And I hadn't talked to or thought of my mother in over 2 decades. That's not true. I did think of her. I hadn't talked to her in over 2 decades. And this person made everything sound super dire, mentioned some facts that could be fact-checked, and on fact-checking, they were accurate. So I saw my mother 2 weeks before she died of COVID. So I spoke to my mother once on the phone for about 2 minutes, the first time in 25 years. And I said, it's been a while. And she immediately shot back with not long enough. 2 weeks later, she died of COVID. And I've been reliving my childhood trauma. And it has not been fun. But I do want to point out that I'm living. My world might have gotten knocked off kilter 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago. I've done the math in my head. It was 2 years ago. My world might have been knocked off kilter 2 years ago. But that was only because there wasn't a very strong foundation to begin with. Trauma is trauma. Whether you agree with the person that the person has been traumatized or not, it doesn't matter. That person was traumatized. A person's reaction to trauma is that person's reaction to trauma, and you don't have a say in its appropriateness. None whatsoever. And tread softly on the people in your lives, because you have no idea what people are going through. That information about my mother was never shared with the people that I worked with, because I did not trust them enough to share it with them. When I finally got up the gumption to share it with them, I wanted to share it with everybody all at once so I didn't have to say it over and over again, and one person told me to off. So I off and never shared it with anybody. I never shared it with them. And from the way they treated me anyway, I don't think they would have cared. I don't think they would have seen it as traumatic. I don't think they would have agreed with my response to it. And those last two are things that they don't get to choose. But they would have tried to anyway because they were my bullies. So, you never know what someone's going through. No matter what face they show you in public, you have no idea what's going on behind their eyes. So the only thing that I can say is, since you don't know, treat everyone with kindness. That you can do, that you are responsible for. Just be kind to people, because you have no idea what they've suffered, because most people won't tell you. If I saw you in real life, I probably wouldn't tell you any of this. You'd interact with me, but you have no idea what was behind the face that you saw. So tread softly on people's feelings, tread softly on people's minds, tread softly on people's emotions, tread softly on people's pride. Just tread softly, because everyone deserves to be happy. And I think I just used the same color paint again. Whoops. Oh well. Ah! These mushrooms are dry enough, I can just stand them up now. So, that's my story on trauma. Trauma is different for everyone, but trauma is trauma. If someone tells you that they've been traumatized, they've been traumatized. You do not have a say in the judgment of the trauma. You cannot say, oh, well, that's nothing, here's my trauma, because that's not fair either. If a person tells you they've been traumatized, period. If they've chosen to share that with you, don't berate don't add whatever you feel to their level of trauma, because it's not a competition and nobody really wants it. So, ooh, this is a pretty color. Ooh, I like this color. Oh, that's beautiful. This one's called Burgundy. It's from that metallic set that I have. This isn't the iridescent set. This is just the metallic one. That is a gorgeous color. Look at that. That's beautiful. This is my first time using that color. Gorgeous. So please bear in mind these things that I've told you, because the effects of trauma are long-term and they're difficult to deal with. And I spent most of my life burying mine. And now that I'm getting help for it, I see a huge difference. Okay. Now that I'm getting help for it, I see a small difference that I can foresee becoming a huge difference. Let's put it that way. I don't see a huge difference yet. I see a small difference that I can foresee becoming a huge difference. And that means something. That means a lot. So tread softly. And that was a pitfall that I got into in the Me Too movement, where somebody would tell me what they had experienced. And since it was, in my opinion, so much quote unquote less than what I had experienced, that I had momentary thoughts where they didn't get to count that as trauma. And it was pointed out to me by someone else that it didn't matter what my opinion was. So I fell into that trap too. So I understand why you can fall into that trap. But I'm here to tell you that's not a trap that's fair for the other person, and that's not a trap that's real anyway. Don't put yourself in that place. Don't decide that you get to determine whether or not someone else's trauma is bad enough to count as traumatic. So. I have no idea how long it's going to be before I put up another video, so whatever length of time it is, remember, it's okay to not be okay. Seek out help if you like, and I hope you have a wonderful length of time.